All right, fantastic. Yeah, great to great to be with you all, and yeah, it's an absolute pleasure. I feel like we've been together without being together. Um, as you've probably seen me in a few of the videos that you've been watching. So this is I was in the first masterclass, Emmanuel, wasn't I? And now the last one, right? So I think it's befitting to yeah, just congratulate all of you for, just sticking it out. And of course, I know it's not been easy, but nothing amazing isn't. So like Emmanuel mentioned, we are now, getting to the last one, Masterclass 5, where we're going to focus on regulatory and public sector scaling. And I think it's such an interesting one because it comes at the end of everything. It's once you've figured out um, the entire journey, then you're thinking about how do we scale our initiatives? How do we take them to market? How do we make sure that we are compliant? So, a big part of the journey today will be around figuring out how do we make sure that we involve public sector? And the question is, I guess, how? For a lot of you, you already are working with public sector. As we were profiling some of you, we know some of you already, running some initiatives with public sector. But I guess it's how do we scale those? And it even gets a bit more complex when you're talking about scaling across countries, because if you're a Kenyan health tech, you're thinking about going into West Africa, you're on Ivory Coast, startup trying to get into South Africa, the dynamics are very different. And what we're hoping to get you guys up to speed with is what are the things you need to start doing so that you're ready for that transition. So this is the journey we've taken. If you remember, we started off with looking at how we make sure we have a product and map it to a real problem. Masterclass 2, we focused on how do we take that to market. We then moved on to thinking about the back office, which is operations. We then started thinking about how do we make sure we are ready for investment. And then lastly, we are here today to think about how we scale those innovations. So I'm not going to recap this. So I'll just jump straight in because, like Emmanuel mentioned, we do have, quite a bit to go through. But yeah, like he mentioned, please, feel free to stop me at any point if unclear. So the first part we're going to tackle is the regulatory landscape. And what we try to do with this masterclass differently from all the other masterclasses is to try and infuse where you guys are from. So we profiled all the countries you're from, because now we are sort of getting to rubber hitting the road, So we really wanted to give you guys some good context. So what you find in this masterclass, we've tried to introduce different countries, different contexts, and just to give you an idea of even in your specific country, what are the things that you need to look out for. So when we're thinking about the regulatory landscape, some of the things we need to consider is, first of all, how much funding is going into it, and this is pertinent for all of us. So the valuation of the sector is 10 billion by 2025, right? And that's not too far. That's just next year. So you're looking at a very active market that's growing year on year, which tells us that, if you combine everything, grant funding, government funding, private sector funding, venture funding, it is a very attractive sector, one that has a lot of suitors. So we need to be ready for it. That's the key message there. We are many of us, so there are a lot of people trying different things. Of course, we know this. There are probably more than this. These are just the ones that are well documented. But as you can imagine, we are fighting for competitive space, right? So regardless of the sector you're in, the micro sector you are in, it's about unfair advantage. We talked about unfair advantage in Masterclass 2, 3, probably even in 4. And we're talking about the whole idea of making sure that we have something that the market just can't replicate. Now, that comes in very handy when you're talking about scale and this competitive space that I've highlighted there. And of course, what this does is it creates a lot of regulatory pressure. As you will see, there's so many different nuggets and pieces of compliance, and it even gets more complex depending on where you are, that you need to look at. So there's so much regulatory pressure, not just on you as the health tech, but also on the regulator side. They're also, depending on the country and the level of development, they're looking for inspiration on what do they do, right? Because it's just not clear. So ultimately, and why this means something to us, it causes some uncertainty, you know. Um, for example, only 8% of African countries have established regulations for online pharmacies. You guys do know that, you know, the case study we've been using in Concern Health and Abina has been built around the idea of an online pharmacy. So you can see even for our fictional business, we are in uncharted waters in most of the countries that we would want to expand to across Africa. So some are fairly well developed, as you'll see. Some don't exist at all. Some don't even have regulations, don't even have a policy to guide, right? And that adds to the level of complexity and uncertainty in the market as we proceed. So here are some of the key aspects that now we'll witness as we go through the idea of scaling, especially as we move from one country to another or from one region to another. So, of course, the lack of clear guidelines, that's the clearest one when you're trying to do your research and you're thinking of moving into Ethiopia, you're thinking of moving into Egypt, you're thinking of moving into Kenya, and you're trying to do your research, but there's nothing, right? That's, you know, the clear sign that, you know, there are no guidelines. Time-consuming approval processes sometimes indicates that there is some kind of a guiding principle, but maybe the policy is not super clear. So there are so many levels of bureaucracy that need to be attended to, and just the process is not clear, right? So when you see something that took you 1 month in Uganda, taking you 6 months in Kenya, or taking you 9 months in Nigeria, as you do this and that, you might realize that there's a problem around maybe the process. It just doesn't exist, or it's not clear to those who are executing it. And of course, the big one that I've been talking about is inconsistencies across regions. So you find that, you know, what may be a guiding policy for online pharmacies in Zambia may be different from what is in South Africa. And those countries are not too far from each other. Or even, you know, a good example is the Ivory Coast and Ghana, or Ghana and Nigeria. You might find that they have different policies, guidelines, and regulations for online pharmacies. And that's something that we just need to contend with. And of course, lastly, is inadequate data privacy and security regulations. Now, why this is important is because we want to show as a health tech that we are compliant, whether we are being forced to do it or not. On the funding side, we're talking to owners of capital. We want to show them that we have done our homework, that we are compliant on the data side. Now, countries that have advanced regulations around data, those are the countries that investors want to spend a bit more time in. And for the simple reason being that, you know, it shows that that market is a little more mature just in terms of privacy of data. Because again, remember, funders are accountable to other funders who may have something that they look out for, especially around data. So that's something to watch out for as you're thinking about your scaling. Now, I want to jump into just some examples we put out for you guys in terms of regulatory bodies that you should look out for. And again, what we try to do is create categories, and then try and give some examples, you know, just based on some of the countries we know that the health tech you guys are from, basically. So we have the first category is regulatory, food and drug regulatory authorities. And you can see those examples there that we've given everywhere from Egypt, Rwanda, Uganda. So this is one that was fairly well, I would say, documented. So this, you know, we found something in almost every country that you guys are from. So everything from Egypt all the way to Nigeria, Ghana, in Kenya, and in fact, in some countries, we had more than one, right? And that just shows the level of maturity of this category under food and drugs sort of regulation. And as I go through this, you'll realize one thing. You might find that there's one, depending on what you're doing as a health tech, you might find yourself falling in multiple categories. And that's most likely the case actually for most of us. The second category is health professionals or health profession regulatory bodies. We found a few. Again, the ones we didn't find, it just could be maybe the data is not publicly available, or it just might take a bit more digging from your part. But I think what I'd like you to take out of this discussion is not so much the specific bodies, it's the categories, right? The third category is health insurance regulatory bodies. Of course, these are guys who are regulating the insurance space, specifically around the medical angle. You've got data protection. And again, one of the things you'll note is that in some countries, We have policies, in others we have laws, but in others we even have declarations. We don't even have a policy or a law yet. So it might be called different things to different people in different countries. But again, like I keep saying, take note of the category. Then we have medical research and ethics. Again, if you're conducting any kind of research, you're doing some kind of um, experiments, of course, ethics, comes to the fore, is something that you need to actively look out for. Then you've got public health, general health regulatory bodies. Again, you can see the overlap, right? Because you might find the Food and Drug regulator also having a role to play here as well. So just, food for thought there. And then environmental and health safety, right? Again, this is an area that in some countries is pretty well developed and in some is at infancy stage. Closely linked to that are frameworks, and I want to distinguish, between the frameworks and what we had here as the bodies, right? And the frameworks are, I would say, more overarching. They give us a bit of a bigger bath. And I'd like us to look at both in your context and try and think about what are those, I'd say, frameworks, more overarching around what it is that we're doing. As we're going to market, these are things we have to contend with. And again, even with this, I don't want you to spend too much time looking at the specific codes or laws or acts of parliament or whatever. It's more the category, right? So the first category is health and medical regulations. You can see the ones that we found there. These are mostly looking at overall health systems, healthcare delivery, public health initiatives, and infrastructure. So again, when you hear the word infrastructure, you may be talking about the buildings and the equipment and everything, but for some of us who are hardware heavy, you might be counted there as well. So again, look out for those definitions because they may put you in more than one category. Then you've got pharma and medical devices regulations. Now, this is very specific to us as HealthTech Hub. When you talk about the idea of medical devices, you'll find there specific sections within, for example, an act of parliament that may talk about medical devices. So again, look out for that because a big part of it, they may look the same as you move from one category to another, but you need to take note of the categories and see, again, where you are. The third one is around data protection. Again, we've talked about this, the idea of making sure that, even if the law is not, up to speed, that you are compliant because your investors will be looking out for that kind of compliance. It gives them that level of comfort that something, would come back and bite them later on, for example, because you didn't take care of the data or it was infringed on or it was sold or whatever it might be. So just watch out for that. The fourth one is around the idea of health insurance. We've talked about health insurance, but now we introduced an aspect of financing where you're talking about both the insurance and the financing of the insurance. There's a lot of innovation around, of course, e-commerce and how it can play a role in financing insurance. So something to watch out for as we look at that. The fifth one is looking at clinical trials. So again, frameworks around research, ethics, clinical trials, research are things that we need to look out for. So like, I'll give an example. If you look at Kenya and South Africa, it's still the same Pharmacy and Poisons Act, but there's a clinical trials sort of module within. So something we need to look out for. Again, you need to do the research around how far those are, because you might find that it may be there in the policy, it may be there in the act, but it's not actualized. So that's something that, again, will require you to dig a little deeper. And you'll find a lot of these organizations, a lot of these the regulatory bodies that we discussed earlier, they do have sessions where they interact with stakeholders. So you need to immerse yourself in a big way so that you know what they're up to. At bare minimum, make sure you're attending their annual general meetings or their annual meetings where they bring all the stakeholders together so that you get up to speed with what's going on and where their heads are at. You've got environmental and health and safety. This is that whole area around protecting public health and the environment, managing waste, pollution, and safe working conditions. So we haven't quite talked about safe working conditions. So again, depending on what it is that you're doing, it's something that you'll need to look out for. And then coming towards the end of this now is regulations for ethics specifically. And sometimes you might find it has nothing to do with the medical side per se. And so you'll see, for example, in Nigeria, there's the National Health Research Ethics Committee, which is very specific in terms of health research. But in Kenya, for example, we've got NACOSTI, which regulates everything from the health side to if you're an engineering student and you're doing some research, they regulate that as well. So just something to think about. You can see in Congo, it's a National Ethics Committee, which may not necessarily be super health focused, but they do have the gambit on ethics as a whole. Then we've got telemedicine. Of course, I slid this in because of our fictitious startup. We are in the telemedicine space, and a lot of you are, so something to think about. There are some regulations around telemedicine and digital health provision because it's just been such a high focus area over the last maybe 5 years. And so, governments have been trying to sort of catch up and make sure they have something. So again, look out for that. And then nine, we have biotechnology and genomics, right? Again, maybe not a brand new area, but I think one that has gotten a lot of traction more recently as we're now advancing a lot quicker in terms of machine learning and AI. I think we're going to see a lot more of this. What that means then is, and of course, after COVID, but what that means is, of course, that organizations will generally be ahead of most regulators in terms of what is required. So a bit of thinking around that as you think of which market to go to. So you can see, for example, Kenya, South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Uganda, Tanzania, and so on, all have sort of a biosafety law or regulation. And in some cases, you might find, like in Ethiopia, it's a proclamation. So something to watch out for in terms of what the difference is and maybe what that means for you. And then lastly is occupational health. This is basically safety of the people that you're working with, protecting your employees from workplace hazards and occupational diseases. So just those categories I wanted us to look at as we move on to now how you need to build your own strategy, because ultimately we want to take all this information and sort of place it in the context of our own business. So we provided with you guys a framework you could use. It's, I think, a 7-step process. And the first one starts with conducting a thorough regulatory analysis. So if you think of what we've done over the last 23 minutes or so, that's sort of what we've been doing in passing, and I've been going through it real quick. But you're trying to understand what are the laws, regulations, proclamations, policies, what are the lobby groups pushing for across. And you can have a nice table where you say, these are acts of parliament, these are policy recommendations, these are policies that are coming in the next couple of years, and then this is what lobby groups are chasing for. And why that's important is because you need to have a thorough view of what's there and also what's coming. Because sometimes what's coming can kill you as a business, right? Because you can have a policy that's passed that makes it either illegal or makes just life a lot more difficult for you. The second one is about creating a framework, and we provided a framework in the, if you go to the info packet, you'll find something we call the Master Risk Compliance Checklist. So again, just go through that because you can put the details of your context, your country, which then forms what you and your team are reviewing on a monthly or quarterly basis, right? So again, develop a centralized compliance framework, and that's what you're going to use, keep checking how you're doing in terms of compliance. If possible, appoint a dedicated compliance officer. The reality is we don't have the luxury of not focusing on this, right? So if it's not a dedicated resource that you've hired full time, you may want to dedicate a couple of hours of some of your team members to work on compliance because there's work to be done. But if all else fails, try and outsource it. But ultimately, you need some kind of focus, some kind of ownership, because as you can see from just a review of what we've gone through so far, it's murky. There's a lot going on. There's so many players involved, and you need somebody who's actively tracking the process as you go through it. Then, of course, is the training, capacity building internally. So even as you're driving compliance, a big part of compliance is not just saying, we adhere to the policy or we adhere to the law, but how much does your team actually know what the policy entails and how it affects how they work, right? That's critical. And regular will be up to you, but I would say minimum every quarter, you should get the team together, pick a policy that affects you, and then just go through it together with the team. You might be surprised how much new knowledge you might create that you can actually use either for lobbying or at the next sort of regulatory meeting. You can use that data to drive what you want, what will work for your specific context. Five would be establishing a monitoring and auditing system. Now, ultimately, it's great to have all these KPIs and everything in there, but I always recommend you need to have very simple measures that you're going for. How do you know you have achieved success in terms of compliance? I hear people saying, for example, 100% compliance. But what does that actually mean when you say 100% compliance? So you need to create the picture of success for what 100% compliance to a policy means, or to a regulation or whatever it might be. So just food for thought around that. But either way, have some kind of way to audit the progress that you're making so that you're able to see what you need to do different. And then reporting, the recommendation here is to make sure that is to suggest having a subcommittee within your company, within your teams, who report back to the rest of the company, maybe on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis, depending on, again, the context of where you're from. Why that's important is because you want to make sure that the whole company is abreast, or the people who need to know really are abreast with what, the progress so far, and maybe what's right, what's wrong, and where they're needed. Because sometimes you might need the input of folks from the company across different parts of the company. And yeah, it's good to get them on board so that they can see the journey of compliance together. And then, of course, engage with the regulatory bodies, right? It goes without saying, like I mentioned, a lot of these regulatory bodies will have annual general meetings. After COVID nowadays, we have a lot of webinars. Um, and if all else fails, we have LinkedIn, right? You'd be surprised how much you can get away with on LinkedIn, and how you can almost connect with almost anybody you want to connect with on LinkedIn, and start driving discussions around this is not necessarily what's good for your company, but what's good for the industry, right? And if that organization doesn't exist, then you might want to think about how to bring together like-minded people and form an association, right? Because a regulatory body may also shy away from dealing with you one-on-one, especially if you're not many of you. But if you can come together as a sort of an association, they are actually mandated. Most regulatory bodies are mandated by law to actually accommodate feedback from associations. So just food for thought there. Again, look at the specific law provisions and in the policies and all that, and see what that looks like for different bodies. So here's an example. We did this for, again, our company, Concern Health. Remember, we are serving Abina, our persona. I think we've tried to keep that consistent across. And you can see some of the areas that we are looking at as we are launching in Nigeria. So this is our more recent expansion into Nigeria. We're being very aggressive. And you can see these are some of the compliance risks that we have identified. So there's non-compliance with health regulations, NHA Act 2014. There's the pharmaceutical and medical device regulations, NAFDAC. There's NHREC. This is clinical trials, because again, we're doing some experiments. There's the data breaches and cyber threat law, or compliance, NDPR, and so on and so forth. So you can even see for our fictional company, we've created sort of gaps. We know that we don't have this, and we know it will affect our ability to launch in Nigeria successfully from a regulatory perspective. So the question I have for you is, what is this for you, right? And maybe a little more detailed than this. This was just, for presentation. But I think once you sit down with your team, you should be able to get a lot deeper, and actually come up with, again, back to the compliance framework, and see how you're doing for each of these, and make sure that now you'll have a plan towards compliance. Yeah, this is what it looks like. I mentioned the risk compliance matrix. Again, if you go to your info packet, you'll find an Excel that we gave you guys as a template that you can start using. It has the following columns. You've got the criteria. So in this case, non-compliance with health regulations. If I'm not wrong, that is, uh, yeah, the NHA 2014. Then you've got current state, 1 to 5. So 5 is fully compliant, 1 is, not very good. 0 is maybe we're not even aware of it, right? We just found out about it last week. Of course, we all want to be 5. In this case, we put 3 for that one. You describe the current state. Where are we now? For this one, we said partial compliance with NHA Act 2014. Um, for your perspective, I need you guys to go a lot deeper. It's not enough to just say partial compliance. You probably need to go to a lot more detail around maybe why you're not compliant. Because again, I can see a scenario where as you're trying to raise capital, these are some of the documents that conform your appendix or your annexure, and they just give a lot more wealth to the state of the business. And the realities of some of the things that you're going through. Then you've got the column on desired future state. Again, we oversimplified and just said full compliance. But again, I can see a scenario where compliance is a step-by-step process. So rather than it being something that we chase over a 2-year period, you can actually have milestones where you say we want to be 30% compliant in the next 6 months. Then you and your team need to define what does 30% compliance actually mean, right? And then you've got action steps to move towards the future state and then a budget, right? And the budget could be, depending on what you guys need. For us, we needed this compliance, and we put a budget of about $3,500. So again, I would say jump into this in your info packet and try and go through this process because it will be quite useful as you go through it with your team. So I want us to think about partnerships. And we've talked about partnerships before in Masterclass 1 and 2, but we're going to use a different lens because now we are thinking about public sector. Initially, when we thought about partnerships, we were thinking about it in the context of go to market, right? So who do we need to launch in that market? Do we need the investors? Do we need we never really talked about public sector per se. So I wanted us to spend a bit more time looking at public sector. And what we did is we gave you guys a cheat sheet here on some categories that you can use to guide what type of partner to chase, right? So we've got ministries of health, national health insurance agencies, public hospitals and clinics, regulatory bodies, medical research institutions, donors and family foundations and offices. You've got tech-related partners, your likes of Amazon, Microsoft, and so on, community health worker programs, public health training institutions, and then public health campaigns and initiatives. So these are 10 categories. And I know some of you may be looking at this and thinking, yeah, some of them look like you can collapse them into others. This is just our suggestion, right? Take what works for your context and run with it. Um, but to provide some kind of like usability, this is one that we did again for Nigeria. As you can see, we are very aggressive. We're now thinking about Nigeria a bit more aggressively. We identified 5 different partners. So the first one is the Ministry of Health, which is the Federal Ministry of Health. And the idea is to partner with the ministry to align and consult health initiatives with the national health policies and programs, right? And I'll show you a bit later the framework we're going to use. Secondly is national health insurance. We said we want to provide affordable health insurance, right? That's something we want to provide. Why? Because if we can crack that, it means we can have our telemedicine product in the hands of more Nigerians, which is ultimately it's good for our own sustainability, right? Then we've got public hospitals. We identified the Lagos University Teaching Hospital, and specifically to deploy our digital health solutions, right? It could be the pilot or ground zero for the innovation that we have built. You've got the medical research institution as another category. We identified a Nigerian Institute of Medical Research, especially because we want to conduct some trials and see whether our telemedicine product is, what kind of efficacy are we achieving, right? Just like you'd have a drug trial, we're going to have some trials as well because we're very innovative, right? Then we've got public health training institutions, and our angle here is providing training, right? We want to make sure that we can tap into the existing healthcare training network that is already available across Nigeria when you're talking about public health training institutions. So that's just an example. And I want to give you guys the framework because I think in that specific slide, I over summarized the approach. I just sort of went for this is what I want. But I need you guys to, do it a little more strategically, a little more deliberately. And we're going to borrow what we did in Masterclass 2, right? And I think what we've tried to do across all the master classes is keep everything interconnected so that we're borrowing things from each other and we're not constantly creating new things. And if you remember, we had this thing called the partnership canvas, which was ideally step 1 to 4, right? And what we've now tried to do is, so if you look at sort of, if I could change this, so step 1 to 4 was the partnership canvas. So this is what we already covered when we were talking about go-to-market. So what we've done is added 4 more. So we've got number 5, which is talking about measurement of impact of the partnership on public health outcomes. Number 6, we're talking about sustainability of the partnership beyond the initial project phase. It just so happens that a lot of in the health tech space, you might find a lot of pilot programs ongoing where you're given a small sort of setup to implement. But in number 6, we're asking ourselves, how do we go beyond just thinking about the pilot phase? In number 7, we're talking about regulatory requirements, which is what we've spent the last, I would say, 37 minutes talking about, and then alignment with public health objectives, and this is important, political priorities of the government of the day, right? We don't live in a vacuum, we live within political systems. So you need to be conscious of what the government of the day treats as a priority, right? Because if you do not align yourself with those priorities, it's like hitting your head against a brick wall, right? Eventually, you will become successful, but at a great cost, right? And remember, we're talking about public sector scaling. Public sector is equals to government, and in most cases in Africa is equals to the political system of the day. So we have to be cognizant of those dynamics, right? So this is, I would say, the canvas we're going to use. Again, in your info packet, you'll find the assignment for this. I need you guys to go back to the categories, pick the categories that work for you, and then start to really build out the kind of partnerships that you want. And be deliberate about it because even if it's not something that you're chasing for this year, it could be something you need to start thinking about for next year. So ultimately, you want to make sure that you do that as well as possible. So again, if you go to the slides, our business is now launching in Addis. We're really looking forward to it. And so we built the case study around Addis Ababa, which is the Tikur and Bessa Black Lion Hospital. I hope I've not butchered that. And you can see the suggestion of how we'd like you to think about building a partnership canvas for a public sector actor like a hospital, right? Because this is just one category. As you can imagine, if you look here at the categories here, that is just one category, right, of public sector hospitals. Again, you can have multiple categories chosen depending on what it is that you're doing. So again, because of time, I may not be able to go through the Ethiopia case study. But again, just go to your info packet. You'll find all these suggestions there. And again, you can go through it together with your team and then start to really build what works for your context. The next thing I want us to touch on is articulating demand from the public sector side. Again, we've talked about building partnerships, and a big part of building partnerships is because you want to be in the right place at the right time. You want to build a product like we talked about in Masterclass 1 for a problem, right? And a big part of demand articulation is figuring out where is the gap. And it's easy to say, for example, in the telemedicine space, there is a gap, as we have identified with Abina. But the reality is, you might need to go a little deeper in terms of, in the context of a country, a county, a district, You might find different counties, different districts, different provinces have different priorities. They don't prioritize things like telemedicine. They don't have the capacity to do it, so they won't bother with it. Or they might have a specific micro policy that's targeting, for example, telemedicine penetration as part of their way of increasing health access, right? So that's what we're talking about, demand articulation, so that you're in the right space at the right time. And as you can see, our company is being overly aggressive. We are now launching in Rwanda. In Concern Health is taking over Rwanda, and we're going to offer telemedicine services, high quality services in Kigali. And just to show you guys how we're going to use this in that context, the first thing we did is identify public health priorities and spot opportunities and gaps. And that's straightforward, right? Because what you're trying to do is go through documents, right? So in the case of Rwanda, there's the Rwanda Health Sector Strategic Plan. And again, some of these documents may be old, right? This is what we're able to find. So again, take your time and go through the most relevant documents for your scenario. We then conducted interviews and workshops, right? So things you can do online before you even launch. And then utilize data from public health reports. And there's so many of them, guys. Almost every country, you have multiple data points on different things affecting your sector. Have you gone through them? Have you synthesized that data? And because of all the tools we have at our disposal today, whether it's your ChatGPT or your AI analytics platforms, you can synthesize that data into something meaningful, right? And you can use AI, for example, to help you find where the gap is. Instead of you going through 4,000 pages of reports from the last 10 years, you can synthesize that data so that you can find where the gap is specifically, and then start to really align your product, which is the next thing, which is aligning your product with public health needs. Now, why this is important is because it's not so much that we don't know there's a gap in, for example, telemedicine or health access, for example. It's how elaborate does our product need to be? Can we redesign our product so that our MVP is in line with maybe where the market is? So I remember a few years ago when maybe before Android was a bit more mainstream, there was a whole debate about the value of USSD versus Android smartphone type use cases. And you'd find startups really like building out really cool Android apps, really cool platforms, and yet they were a bit ahead of where the market was. And that's what we're talking about here, right? How can you align your product development cycle? So when I look at your roadmap for the next 18 months for your product, I can actually layer it on top of public sector initiatives and plans and funding initiatives and so on. So as you can see, the recommendation is perform a gap analysis, focus on developing features that address critical public health challenges, and of course, working closely with public health experts. And the thing I'd add here is public health funders, right? A lot of the funders who may not necessarily be the government, but have an interest um, in that specific micro space. And then, of course, develop value propositions. We talked about this in my, in Masterclass 1 and 2. So you might want to go back there and see what we did. Um, Pilot. Now, this is what I was talking about. The whole idea of pilot. You need to be comfortable with running pilot projects and demonstrations. Just make sure that it's part of your financial model. It's not something that you're losing money on. It needs to be something that is part of your ladder of products or part of your customer journey so that you know that you're going to invest X amount of dollars into a pilot, which you'll be able to recoup over a period of time. And then the fifth one is build strategic partnerships with the tool that we have just gone through over the last 10 minutes. Develop a strategic public sector partnership, pick the category, then go through the public sector canvas and build that. And then lastly, continuous monitoring and evaluation so that you make sure you're all on the right track, right? Lastly is the whole idea of public sector scaling. Now that we've done all that work, we need to make sure that we take our initiative, our platform to the next level. And there's a quote I really like, which a lot of you may know, which is the whole idea of move fast with stable infrastructure. So it's not just about growing and growing. You need to grow and make sure that you have stable infrastructure. And if you think of all the work we have done from Masterclass 1 to Masterclass 4, we've been building infrastructure, right? And now it's about how do we take that to the next level? How do we make sure we commercialize? And you can see, again, we're being super aggressive with our fictional startup. We're now launching in Dakar. Very proud, it's strategic, and we have a plan over the next 12 months to go there. So to help you understand this, how do we then scale in Senegal, right? Because the case study says that we've been there for 12 months and we're now thinking about moving on to the next level. So approach one is building strong partnerships. So we've already talked about partnerships. So you can tick this off your box once you do that. And you can see there's a little advisory there around the tool to use, right? So that you're able to move to the next level. Approach two is securing diverse funding sources. So you've got different types of funding that we discussed in Masterclass 4. So have those at the back of your mind, because it's not going to be enough to have just one source of revenue. So of course, you're going to need your ladder of products from Masterclass 2 that we discussed, how you're able to monetize at different levels, but also looking at diversified funding sources like your DFIs, your family foundations, and so on. You've then got leveraging technology partnerships. Now, this is very specifically inserted here because we are tech companies after all. You will be surprised about the number of programs that some of the large multinational tech companies have, or in terms of what they may have as a focus in healthcare. So tap into that, identify them, tap into that, and make sure you start building those partnerships. Build a capacity internally, make sure that you have the right capacity. You can see, for example, in terms of local expertise, we've talked about partnering with UCAD, which is the University Sheikh Anta Diop in Dakar, right? So that we can build that capacity of what we're doing in telemedicine and build that knowledge so that it becomes something that is now a bit more mainstream. It will help us with our talent management later. Then M&E, we've talked about that. You need to measure, because I always say as a rule of thumb, what is not measured is not respected, right? I'll repeat that. What is not measured is not respected. People don't respect what's not measured. So just take some time and think about that. Then foster community engagement. Again, we're in the healthcare space, right? We are providing healthcare access in some way, shape, or form. So find a way to integrate yourself into the community. So whether it's involving yourself with local community initiatives or just purely education, whatever it might be, find a way to tap into that, and engage yourself at that level. And then lastly is local innovation hubs and startups. Again, they exist. So for example, in Senegal, we're looking at Impact Hub, which is in Dakar, to see how we can develop or co-pilot initiatives, right? So again, look at, in your specific context, what are some of those hubs, innovation hubs, or startups that maybe are adjacent in terms of sector. They're not competing with you, but could add value. And then start to really build a community around that. That should help in a big way, in terms of helping you scale. So don't ignore those local partnerships and so on. Just a last couple. So we've got approach 8, which is fostering PPPs. Again, PPPs are a different way of looking at the public sector partnerships that we were describing. They may take the shape of a public-private partnership, but that's just one way, right? And a really, I'll say easy way is CSR programs or community engagement programs. They really allow you to buy the trust of the community, but also make sure that on the public sector side, you're somebody that they revere, you're somebody that they look forward to working with, even on a more commercial engagement. Then we've inserted here something very specifically around advancing gender sensitive approaches, and just making sure that every program that you're running, every product that's out there, you found a way of infusing a gender lens, because that is the way of today. You have to find a way to include gender sensitive approaches into everything that we're doing, so that we are not just compliant, but addressing actual needs from the market. And then we've got integrating regional policy and regional institutions. And I think we'll spend the last 2 minutes or so talking about these regional institutions, whether it's the Africa Union, Africa CDC, whether it's, ministerial, inter-government or inter-country health ministry, meetings that are happening. How do you make sure you're part of that, right? So we've made some recommendations there. You've got the AU, ECOWAS, East Africa Community, SADC. They all have their different sort of health pieces coming together. You need to be aware of them and try and plug into them. And then maybe not all of us, but reduce the dependency on grants, right? So grants are great for innovation. They're great to get things started, but grants have never scaled anything, right? So that's just, a fact. For you to have actual scale, you need to think about what a commercial approach looks like. And if you think about the work we did in Masterclass 2 and 3 specifically, around operations, around pricing and investor readiness. This is something that you must think about. So again, great for product market fit, but maybe not for the next level, right? And that's just the reality of the markets that we are in. And then I think this is the last one actually, is storytelling. Storytelling is a big part of everything we must do. If you remember, I highlighted, I think in Masterclass 2, that only 1.4% of all books on Amazon were written by Africans, right? So let me repeat that. 1.4% of books on Amazon were written by Africans, right? Or are written by Africans. While that doesn't say much, but it's like, yeah, we need to get better at storytelling, guys. It's something that we need to get better at, because whether we're using personal stories of us as founders or we are working with the community, we need to get better at telling the stories of the work that we're doing. Otherwise, if you don't tell your story, somebody will tell it for you, and maybe not in the way you would like. And then, yeah, this last one here on engaging think tanks and university research groups. I won't spend too much time on that. So, universities are sources of knowledge. They're always thinking about the next big thing. So always think about how you can engage with them at that level. Now, we identified some global task forces, global and regional task forces that you guys should think about. Again, just look at what is specific in your area. So we've got WHO digital health, UN global health initiatives, especially around digital initiatives. You've got the World Bank groups, health and nutrition population global practice. You've got AU CDC, right? It's Africa CDC. You've got the EAC Health Research Commission. You've got West Africa Health Organization, NEPAD, specifically on the health side. And of course, you've got the African Development Bank, who are aggressively funding different kinds of health initiatives. And you can check out their AFDB Health Strategy 2020-2030, which we're still running on, just to see where their minds are at and see how you can align to that. Yeah, so this is that's what we had for you today. I don't know, Emmanuel, are there any questions? I've not been checking the chat, unfortunately. I'm not sure whether there are any questions.
No, not yet. Is there anybody with a question for Herbert? Or a comment? Seems like you're quite clear, Herbert.
Oh, fantastic. All right. So I think
Yeah.
from my end, yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm looking forward to seeing a lot of you in the public domain. I want to see you guys raising capital, growing big businesses, and really putting Africa's name out there. Yeah, Diallo, I can see your hand is up. Go ahead.
Hi, Herbert. Thank you so much. This is really exceptional. I think we need more people like you to help us understand the path that you're taking to show us it is possible in our continent. Thank you so very much for doing that. So we are in the process of expanding in Senegal, but the challenge that I work in Guinea, right? Right now we are expanding in Senegal. The challenge we are encountering, it's every partner we are seeing is important. How do you prioritize? We are going with the Ministry of Health first, but as you pointed out, it's just to understand the policy and the guidelines of the Ministry of Health. From there, basically, you need to work your way to find other partners. So we are thinking about digital square or path. So how do you prioritize with the limited resources that you have to ensure that you are building strong partnership, because as you know, we have limited resources. And thank you so very much.
Yeah, thanks for that, Diallo. Yeah, I think it all comes down to, I would say, this little compliance checklist that we built here, because you're right, you have to prioritize. You can't go everywhere at the same time. I think it comes down to figuring out what would stop you from launching, right? So there are two things here. There's launching and then there's scaling. In your case, you're talking about moving into Senegal. So for me, if I was looking at 10 things I need to do, the top three would be maybe the ones that would shut me down. And in your case, if all 10 can shut you down, I think it's where maybe you have relationships, because relationships can sometimes get you quite far. So just again, I would suggest just once you fill in this matrix, you can then sit with your team and really decide, in terms of priority, in terms of time it might take to go to get compliant, what is realistic and maybe what is not, right? So ultimately, once you fill this in, only then can you really have that discussion with your team, I think. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
All right. Anybody else comment or a question, a clarification? Yeah, thanks, Harrison. Thanks, Katrina. All right, so if nothing else, I'll hand over back to Emmanuel, and I'm gonna bump into all of you guys, I know, at some point or the other, and I'm just going to look forward to. I haven't seen your faces, but you have all seen mine. So if I don't know who you are, please forgive me. And really looking forward to seeing you guys build amazing big businesses. And yeah, see you soon, guys.
Thank you so much, Herbert. That was great. I have written a ton of notes myself, some really good learnings. I hope we've picked a thing or two for businesses. I'm glad Diallo asked that question, so at least we know there is a startup, at least one, that is actually going to use some of the learnings that we've gotten from this masterclass. And like we've always said, we have this content on our learning platform on Barbell. So this is just an introduction of it, but the rest of it, you'll find it on Barbell, and more details and all the tools that you need to sort of practically apply this, you will find that. And liaise with us, you can reach out to me, or portfolio manager, and we can provide you with details in case you're having any challenges around that. But otherwise, this has been it. This is really it, guys. Unless there is anybody with a comment, this marks the end of our final masterclass. And I mean, the end of our masterclass series. And after this, we will have, of course, a couple of cohort events for the program, but we are also almost a month away from closing. And so I would also encourage you to, go to Barbell, and in case there is any module that you're lagging behind, go through that material as much as possible, because again, at the end of the program, we will need to sort of offload you and onboard another team to the program as well, because we're going to do another call for applications for the next cohort. But otherwise, this has been great. Herbert, thanks a lot for running the session really nicely. It was quite easy for anybody to understand. Even if you're not an expert in some of these things, you made it easy for people to understand. So that's great. Thanks for attending, and
Thank you.
wish you all a good rest of your day and a nice week ahead. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.